Welcome back to Culture, Power, and the Pen, the podcast where we explore the voices of Asian minority communities through writing and storytelling. I'm your host, Andy. And in episode 2, I'm honored to speak with Tenzin Tsundue. He's a Tibetan poet, writer, and activist. Born in exile in India, Tenzin has spent his life fighting for Tibetan freedom through both protest and poetry. His work blends personal struggle with political resistance and offers powerful insight into what it means to live without a homeland. Today, we'll talk about identity, activism, and how language can be a source of strength. Let's begin. So, what first drew you to poetry and storytelling? Was there a particular moment that sparked your interest in writing?
Just as you introduced, my name is Tenzin Tsundue. I am a Tibetan refugee living in India. I'm born here in North India and lived in different parts of the country in India as refugees. What I remember from my earliest childhood is how my grandmother used to tell us stories of Tibet. Although we were living in South India, far away from the mountains of Tibet, my grandmother used to tell us stories of snow mountains and yaks, apples and peaches, and nomadic life with yaks and sheep. And that had always become the kind of imaginary homeland, a country I had never seen, but I knew that eventually we were going to go there. And in school, then I realized that we were all refugees, that we had lost the independence of our country, and our grandparents, my parents, had to escape Tibet and come to India. So there I was, I must have been in 5th grade, maybe around 10 years old, and I was trying to identify myself as a Tibetan, born to a Tibetan refugee family, and having this story of being a Tibetan refugee family, finding for ourselves, and a struggle in front of us for a country we had never seen. And this then became a purpose or a goal of my life from very early on, from a childhood, to speak for Tibet, to tell our story, and to keep our story alive, the memories that we inherited from our parents and grandparents, and to be part of the freedom struggle. So that's how I got into writing, because this is a way to tell our story. Now, poetry for me particularly is important because we have a terrific story, and common ordinary words are not enough for me. I needed to tell a very powerful story in a very short, limited time. And therefore, I understood that poetry is the language of imagination. And in poetry, we speak in the vocabulary of metaphors, imagery. Poetry is woven into music, and as we write and when I perform my poetry, it comes alive, and then this becomes the most powerful agent of change.
So, growing up far away from your homeland and in exile, how did that kind of shape the way you saw the world and how you chose to express and write about it?
Well, yeah. So as I was saying, I understood from very early on. I understood that we were born refugees, and that's an unfortunate thing to happen. But I also understood from my teachers, from my older generation Tibetans who had a very strong Buddhist faith and an upbringing, something that they were always driven with optimism, and they were always very positive. And I understood from them that being born born refugee, this is an opportunity for us to become freedom fighters. And freedom, fighters needn't necessarily be painful and suffering like how the terrorists are living very difficult life. I understood from our older generation Tibetans that freedom struggle is the most liberating form of a life, where you fight for the freedom of a collective purpose, but at the same time you try to understand the enemy, and you don't call your enemy an enemy, but look at your enemy as an adversary who is diseased with anger, hatred, and greed.
You know, in Tibet, there's a really rich oral tradition. So, how do you see the role of written and spoken poetry and storytelling in preserving Tibetan identity?
Yeah, when we were in our Tibetan refugee school, this was a school called Tibetan Children's Village School in a place called Patlikul in the Kulu Valley. And the Kulu Valley is one of the most beautiful valleys in North India. It's the valley of the apples and plums. Um, and that's the place where I grew up in the school. And we used to be told by teachers that we all bore an R on our forehead, the English letter R on our forehead, R meaning refugees. So we were often told that we are all born refugees and we have to struggle throughout our life for the freedom of our country. So that remained a kind of an identity for ourselves. And later, I thought about it again and again. And I thought this was unfortunate for a group of youngsters to think of themselves as refugees. So I wrote a poem uh, which says essentially that the English letter R on our forehead uh, may have meant refugees, uh, but it is also the Tibetan word Rangzin, which means freedom. So I am saying in the poem that we may have been born a refugee, but we are destined to be free, which is the Tibetan word R, Rangzin. Um, so there are these aspects that we used to grow up with. So one of the interesting, funny things was about the idea of Superman. So there we were, we calling ourselves refugees with an R on our forehead, but we had seen Superman comic books where there was this very strong man who can fly with an S on his chest. So we used to say Superman is just one, and we are too many with R on our forehead. So therefore, if we were all powerful, educated, and if we developed our mind for kindness, Tibet is definitely going to be free.
So, you know, like Tibet is like a culture with like a really rich oral tradition. So, how do you see the role of written and spoken poetry and storytelling in preserving the Tibetan identity?
Yes, Tibetan language is one of the most ancient of all languages in Asia. Um, and we have a very strong tradition of oral knowledge, passage of knowledge through myths and legends, epics, especially the epic of King Lingesar, the warrior king who lived in the Himalayas. And he is a legendary figure all over the Himalayas, from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh, in Nepal and Bhutan and Sikkim, and also in Tibet. So that's such a uh, epic story. And this story used to be, recited by scholars, recited by people who could mug up lines, and they could sing the epic over days and days. And in Tibet, there are Linkesar stories which used to be sung, and there used to be festivals where such competition of recitation of that epic poetry used to be sung. Then among the village folk, there used to be instant poetry writing competition, where among villages, among kids, among boys and girls, there was this quatrain, which was a basic rhythm in which we could uh, compose a quatrain right there, and we would sing just like this. So I'll give you an example. We would say, Pari panki ingwe la si shi men do tung sha su na nyingi zi ilu ma su sempe hedare. So this is a quatrain where it is rhythmic, and people could compose lines there and then have war of words. Then, of course, after the coming of Buddhism into Tibet in the 7th century, the Tibetan minister and a scholar, Tumi Samboda, who went to India, learned Sanskrit and Pali language, and also adapted one of the Indian scripts called Brahmi into Tibetan. And from then on, there were for centuries translations of Buddhist texts into Tibetan. And today, therefore, Tibetan script, Tibetan language can be written in 8 different scripts. In many languages in the world, there are no scripts for them. There are many languages which cannot be written. They don't have a script. So they adopt scripts, or either the Romanic script or the Chinese script or the Indian Brahmi script. But the Tibetans have been able to develop 8 different scripts in which the Tibetan language can be written. So in that way, Tibetan is such a rich language. But this very Tibetan language is facing danger today in Tibet under the Chinese rule, which is now almost about 75 years. Today, what the Chinese government is doing is they have imposed what is called dual language policy, where the Chinese government is trying to encourage what they call the minorities to learn Chinese language, with which they say that they, what is called the minorities, could get jobs. But with this, what is happening is Tibetan children are forcibly kept in colonial boarding schools, where children above the age of 5 and 6 and all above, they have to compulsorily attend these boarding schools, and where education is primarily taught in Chinese language. So we fear that our children may grow up speaking only Chinese.
I actually see a lot of connections there with Native Americans they were displaced when America was expanding to the west, and a lot of Native American children, they were sent to basically these boarding schools where they had to cut their hair. They have to integrate into American culture. They have to learn the American language. So I see a lot of connections there with the Tibetans who are also going to these boarding schools where they're forced to learn Chinese and stuff like that. So, was there a moment when you sort of realized that your story and your people's story wasn't being told in the broader world?
Well, Tibetan story is now being told. We are ourselves writing our story. There are a number of Tibetan youngsters who are writing our story in the form of novels, poetry, articles, and fiction books, and also films, animations are now coming. I've been to United States myself 4 times, and I've seen the impact of colonization among the Native Americans, and also in Canada. It was unfortunate that such kind of reservations were created, and because of which today the Native Americans and Native people in Canada had to suffer so much. And I've seen that condition in Australia, in Brazil also. But I also understand today there is equal opportunity among the Americans, among the natives, and also people who have come from different parts of the world who are now settled in Canada, or in Australia, or in United States. There is equal opportunity today. But what they had to undergo during the reservations period, it's a um, it's a loss, irrevocable loss. Yes.
So, when you were younger, were there any people, books, or experiences that really helped you find a sense of purpose or home?
Well, I think ours was although a very small Tibetan refugee school, but we had very dedicated Tibetan teachers, other staff members. We were a small group of Tibetan refugee community under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who had such a far-seeing vision to firstly restart our life in exile here in India. And also, the government of India has been really kind and generous to give us that kind of a facility to set up Tibetan schools where we received modern education on par with Indian students, but also we were given the space for ourselves to receive and preserve our own traditional cultures in the form of performance arts, traditional Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, medicine, and also craftsmanship in wood carving, painting, traditional dance. All sorts of Tibetan arts and craftsmanship were developed and preserved in our community. So we were really fortunate that we had that kind of a leadership with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the able number of Tibetan staff who dedicated their life in keeping the dream of Tibet alive, and also support from government of India.
You read a lot of poetry, so can you recall like a time when putting your experiences into words really helped you process something difficult, perhaps like a really challenging period of your life?
Yes. My poetry somehow needn't necessarily be political. I My poetry, for me, writing poetry and essays are quite different. When I write essays, I have these political arguments that I feel the Tibetan voice is not there. So I sit continuously for 3 days and come out with a good essay where I make my arguments in English, which then I publish in newspapers or magazines, or now online. But when it comes to poetry, I don't work with an agenda. These are my personal, very, very personal response to things that I see around me. Uh, I in One of my poems is called "When It Rains in Dharamshala." So Dharamshala is the capital of the Tibetans in exile. It's a small hill station in the north of India, and that's the place where His Holiness the Dalai Lama lives. The Tibetan government in exile runs from there, and almost about 10,000 Tibetan refugees live there. And Dharamshala has a unique characteristics of having 3 months of monsoon season where we get so much of rain. So I ended up writing a poem about an old British bungalow, which I have rented from an Indian family. And during the monsoon, this house gets flooded, and not only because of the dripping from the roof, but mostly from the underground. Water seepage happens, and then my room gets flooded. So I love that idea of uh, um, you know not being able to settle down in India, as because we are not citizens of India. At the same time, not being able to return to Tibet because we are not considered citizens there. We are considered foreigners in Tibet and also in India. So living in between idea of a homeland and the reality of exile. That's such a funny situation. In fact, strange. And for me, that's a poetic moment. And as a writer, I find that space, neither here nor there kind of a situation, really interesting. Because that's a place then you suffer, you struggle, but at the same time, this is this space also for growth, empowerment, and also great sense of imagination.
So, what do you feel like is biggest challenge when it comes to writing stories of exile and resistance and Tibetan culture for audience who may not really share that context or experience?
Well, I think one of the challenges in writing your memory or your imagination is how to negotiate between the personal and the political. Sharing something deeply personal is always difficult for all writers. So therefore, very often writers resort to poetic imagination, or they write fiction, or they write novels, because there you go anonymous. But everything that the writer is writing, it does not come from vacuum. It comes from your own personal experiences, or a story that you heard from your neighbor, from your friends, from your family. And these then are internalized in such a way that this becomes an anonymous character. So writing your personal story, at the same time epitomizing that as an experience of another Tibetan refugee. These are some of the challenges. But for me, I'm not a prolific writer like many other people do. I take a lot of time in composition, especially poetry. Some of my poems took 10-15 years to finally come into some form of a shape, and I would give it a finality in the with the form and the diction and a complete structure. So for me, these are my personal challenges, because I take a lot of time. I'm a composer. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a in that way a prolific writer. So these are my own personal challenges.
Moving on to like a topic that's lighter, about the Tibetan culture and community, traditions. Are there any rituals or memories from Tibetan New Year or Sakadawa that hold really special meaning to you?
Yes, I think one of the most memorable things are the Tibetan New Year, which usually falls in the month of February or March. And because we also follow a lunar calendar, sometimes our days are little earlier from the Chinese New Year, sometimes little after Chinese New Year's. But the rituals that involve Tibetan New Year, most importantly, it's a moment in a year to get all the family members together. And one of the challenges being Tibetan refugees is that uh, we mostly study in the north, where our schools were, and but our parents and family are mostly in Tibetan refugee camps in South India. So we were always very far separated. But whenever there was any moment where we could come together, this would happen once in 4 years, 5 years, and those are very precious moments where we get to celebrate the Tibetan New Year, which we heard from the elders that it used to go on for 10-15 days in Tibet. But in exile, it's just for three days, and we get to eat Tibetan cuisine, wear new clothes. So as refugees, we had never seen new clothes. It's only on the New Year that our parents and family, they used to take special extra courage to spend money for a new set of clothes. So these were something that were very endearing for me, to think of such moments. And one of the things was also uh, momo, or what we call that Tibetan cuisine, dumpling. In Chinese they call dumpling, but as we call it momos. And momos used to be this special food stuffed with mutton. We get to eat once in 3 times in a year. One is on the New Year, the other one's on the Dalai Lama's birthday, and one is on Children's Day. So 3 times in a year. Now, in India, the this very food, Tibetan food, has flourished, has become one of the choices, fast foods in India. Every street corner in India, they are selling momos. And now because Indians are mostly vegetarian, so there are potato momos and vegetable momos and tofu paneer momos also coming about. So what used to be such a rare moment of a special cuisine has now become a fast food all over India. So such a change of time.
Mm. In my culture, dumplings is, the comfort food everybody thinks of when they think about comfort food, right? Well, during the Chinese New Year, we would eat it with our family members. There's, different fillings like chives or cabbage and pork, right? So, it's just such a comfort food, right? And, moving on, like, how do you see, the younger generations of Tibetans engaging with their heritage and culture?
Well, I think among the Tibetan youngsters, um, because we from very early on, right from age 2 3, they get to learn spoken Tibetan with their parents, or in and later on in school. There is always a very important focus given on learning Tibetan language and culture, and especially language, because we know that your culture, your identity, everything boils down to speaking the language. If you lose the language, you lose the culture, and with your culture you lose your identity, and therefore then the identity crisis comes about. So therefore knowing your mother tongue is essential. So therefore every effort is put in to give Tibetan children Tibetan language education, even in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, wherever the Tibetan refugees have gone and settled. um, Although their children go to local American schools or Canadian schools, there is always on second Saturdays or on Sundays there are special Tibetan schools set up for them. So during weekends, Tibetan children learn music, painting, dance, singing, and prayers, Buddhist prayers, and also learn, most importantly, learn Tibetan language and also calligraphy. So these are special focus given for Tibetan children to receive this education, which is their basic rights. Without the language, their identity is incomplete. And I've seen many immigrants in Europe and in America and Australia, where immigrants are at loss, that they are neither are able to become American, nor have they maintained their own identity of a country where they came from, maybe from Africa or China or from India. They are neither a native nor are able to become the people of the country they are settling into. So immigrants are always at loss. So therefore, looking at those conditions, Tibetan children, whether they are here in India or in Western countries, the parents and the older generation, they are always so very careful to give them proper and complete Tibetan language education.
So, looking back at what you've accomplished, how do you define success as a writer and activist? Has that, definition shifted over time?
Well, I think for me, my ultimate goal is, of course, to regain the independence of Tibet, and that we are able to take His Holiness the Dalai Lama, our spiritual and political leader, with us back to Tibet. Now, that's a national struggle and it may take time. But we all believe that within the lifetime of His Holiness, such a change would happen. But for that, we need to work hard. It is easier said than done. Um, but then our goal is not just to fight for the freedom, but do it through non-violence, and that's always been the guidance given by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We have seen freedom, independence, and democracy that had happened in South Africa, in India, in Chile, and many of the Eastern European countries who have seen freedom and democracy in their own lifetime through non-violence. And we believe that such a change is possible.
What do you hope people, both Tibetan and non-Tibetan, carry with them and, take away after reading your work?
Well, I think most importantly, what I think we all value is essentially as a human being, it is important that you may be undergoing the most difficult challenge in your life or one of the most difficult colonial occupations. At the same time, that you never lose hope. And your hope comes from your optimism. And our leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has always encouraged us that your happiness, your genuine happiness in your heart does not come from amount of money you have or amount of wealth and weapons you have or political reach that you have. His Holiness says that genuine happiness in your life must come from your kindness, your practice of kindness, the capacity to forgive your enemy, and also the sensitivity that you develop in yourself to be kind and understanding even to your own enemy. That humanity that you practice, and also to assume this humanity in others, and particularly your enemies, one who is causing that pain and suffering on you. One must not lose the faith of humanity in your adversary. I think that's such a powerful advice that His Holiness is giving us, and He's guiding us with such life lesson. I think these are the things that whether Tibet is free today or tomorrow or not, we must continue to live with that kind of positivity. And if as long as we carry that positive attitude, that we maintain that optimism, I would think that Tibet as a country may not be free, but we are free, at least from our own anger, hatred, and greed.
So, if you were ever able to talk to your younger self, at the start of your journey as a writer, what advice or thoughts would you share with him?
Well, I think for a writer, it is most important to firstly master a language. Whether you are going to write in your mother tongue or write in English or any other language, whatever language in which you are going to write, one must have a mastery over that language, authority over that language. And in order to achieve that mastery over that language, one must very seriously take your language, or what you say, what others say, what you read. And if you're reading, you read so very carefully that you go into the basic etymology of the word, and look at the different phases of syntax, the grammar that has changed over many years. Every word has a history, and every morphology has a history. So therefore, know your language is first. Second, writing is so very powerful. Your word has that power to change people. And as much as the power that you wield with your pen, it is also important to bear responsibility to what you're writing. Because writing can, malign people, can bring down dictators, can encourage and make blind see. can make blind faith see reason. So writing is so very powerful, but at the same time, one must be truthful, honest, and sincere in your writing. Then the writing will bear that kind of power, and therefore taking that responsibility as a writer is ultimately important. It is your own personal responsibility. So my personal belief is that you write not because you enjoy writing for entertainment, but writing with a purpose. That there is a purpose as a human being, not only the creativity with which you write, but a purpose, a social change, a mission. I think that is important. Whether you are writing or you may be an artist, a painting or sculpture, or an actor or a singer or musician or a dancer, uh, or even an animation artist, a social mission is so very important.
So, transitioning to the last few questions as we get closer to end the podcast, if you could recommend one book, poem, or piece of art that captured the spirit of Tibet, what would it be?
Um, Recently, I read the latest book by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's called The Voice for the Voiceless. Um, Initially, when I started to read, it was all about Tibet and what Tibet had to undergo. But towards the end, I understood that he is speaking for a larger audience. That the voice is not just his voice, and the voiceless are not just Tibetans, but a larger world community where there is today, because of consumerism and consumerism that has been globalized, there is a large number of people who are voiceless, who have been deprived of, who've been subsumed by corporate companies and dictatorship and hegemonies. And now there are wars going on. There are two live wars already going on, and entire world is divided between these two wars, and other threats are still going about. So therefore, His Holiness the Dalai Lama says it's important for every individual to be your own voice, to speak and stand up against injustice, to speak the truth, and at the same time maintain your optimism, maintain your positivity, and never to lose heart. So I think that's such an important voice.
And just one last question for the end of the podcast. What's next in store for you? Are there any projects, books, or ideas you're especially excited about?
Right. Up until now, I've done five thin collections of my writings in form of five books. These are thin collections. Some poems, stories, articles that I've written over 5, 10 years. I put them together in book form. I make my living out of writing. So I live a very old lifestyle. Thereof a wandering minstrel, wandering poet. That some of the things that I've written, I publish, and I travel all over India. I travel for 7 to 8 months in a year, and through these speaking tours, I sell my books, and that pays for my food. So this is a very old lifestyle that I do, but it's a very meaningful one. Now this year, for the first time, I'm sitting down to write a book. I've never done that. All my past books were just random collections of my writing that had happened over some time. This year, I'm particularly excited that I'm sitting down, giving myself the time to sit and write this book. Now, this book is going to be series of hundreds and thousands of Tibetan refugee stories, and all put together, strung together in one big giant tree, where many branches and leaves and flowers and fruits and roots will come about. And this is one book full of Tibetan refugee stories that tell stories of misadventures, separation, resilience, survival, tragedy, and also little moments of victories and triumphs. So So this is going to be a book full of adventures. It will read like a book of adventures from page one to the end. So I'm really excited that I'm working on this book this year.
I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. And, well, that will be the end of episode 2 of Culture, Power, and the Pen.
Thank you, Andrew.